An hour west of St. Louis, on the Katy Trail, you'll find the historic Pierce Store and Prairie. The store, on the National Register of Historic Places, opened in 1896 to welcome the Katy Railroad. The railroad provided a market for crops and brought goods for the store to sell. Just to the east, in Marthasville, Lewis and Clark stopped to camp on their voyage of discovery, both on their trip west and on their return to St. Louis. Today, the Pierce Store serves as a conservation outpost for magnificent Missouri and overlooks 4 acres of native Missouri prairie. As it has for over a century, the store still welcomes visitors looking for a cold drink or respite from the sun on its front porch. Heading west on the Katy from Pierce, riders pass thousands of acres of Missouri farmland. Where river bottom forests once stood, now corn and soybeans grow. Riders can see scattered remnants of the old forests, giant pecans, cottonwoods, and oaks that dot the fence lines at the field's edge. Trelor, less than 4 miles west of Pierce, also sprang up to welcome and profit from the arrival of the railroad in the 1890s. The Trelor Mercantile building was built by German immigrants at the same time and for the same purpose as the Pierce Store, but has a completely different architectural style and construction. In Trelor, the old grain elevator that loaded thousands of train cars with grain from river bottom fields still stands. Today, instead of train cars, the historic elevator overlooks a native tree planting. The trees of Trelor, planted between the Mercantile building and the elevator, illustrate the variety of species that were part of the forests that once covered the river bottom. The trail west of Trelor soon leaves farmland behind for a green tunnel of foliage and thickly wooded bluffs. A few miles west of Trelor, something unique happens. The trail and steep bluffs come together, and soon the river joins in, as riders find themselves pedaling between water and bluff. A broad view of the river unfolds as the accumulated rainfall from much of the American heartland flows by. Water that started its journey in Montana and the Dakotas and will ultimately empty into the Gulf of Mexico. Along the way, the Missouri River provides drinking water to towns from Kansas City to St. Louis. The 10 miles of the trail between Pierce and the Berger Bluffs west of Trelor offer a view of all that makes the Katy spectacular. Missouri's farm fields, historic railroad towns, and spectacular wooded bluffs that border America's longest river. It's all waiting for you to explore. Across Missouri, in rural and urban communities alike, Missouri Humanities engages citizens with accessible programs exploring what it means to be human. A healthy society depends on a citizenry that can live and work well with each other despite our differences. We recognize that when we understand the people, places, and ideas that shape our society, we can connect with others and work together much more productively, becoming a powerful force for change and progress. Through the humanities, we can offer Missourians context and conversations in which to explore the important issues dividing us, discover what unites us, and learn more about ourselves. Last year was turbulent for all Americans. More than ever, we needed the humanities to bring us together and help us learn from past ways of thinking to form a brighter future for generations to come. Our programs created neutral spaces for public dialogue, explored the historical and cultural roots of current issues, uplifted the stories and histories of marginalized groups, supported local community organizations creating meaningful cultural experiences in underserved areas, and encouraged continued learning in topics from civics to literature. As we moved online, we provided more programs to Missourians than ever before, reaching tens of thousands of Missourians from the safety of their own homes. In total, we provided 126 individual programs in 2020. We reached 34,000 Missourians through MH-run programs in 2020. When we add in the number of programs which received MH grants, that number grows to approximately 150,000.
The Missouri Humanities Council has been a great supporter ever since we first opened the Gym Theater. They're really easy to work with. They have always been very interested in our mission and what it is that we're doing. We are forever thankful for the Missouri Humanities Council and their interest in us. And we really feel as if they care about the arts agencies and cultural agencies, not only in Kansas City, but in outstate Missouri as well. That's very important.
I think it also gives us a future knowing that, like the Humanities Council, we'll be there. We'll be there with advice and maybe more grants to do other programs in the future.
Having the support of an organization like Missouri Humanities to tell that story really helps us do that and makes us feel that they recognize the significance.
I know they care, and I'm sure that you care because you're watching this right now.
The Missouri Humanities Council has been so proactive about creating experiences that are tied to place.
Together, we can create a more thoughtful, informed, and civil society.
The UCM History Program wishes the Missouri Humanities Council a happy 50th anniversary.
From us here in Perry County, Missouri, happy 50th anniversary.
Happy 50th anniversary from the home of sliced bread.
Happy 50th anniversary.
Happy 50th anniversary, Missouri Humanities.
Happy 50 amazing years of humanities in Missouri.
And to the Missouri Humanities Council, happy 50th year.
Good evening. I'm really sorry not to be able to deliver this address in person, but I am so honored that Ashley and her entire team at Missouri Humanities invited me to give this year's address. I'm also very grateful that so many of you submitted questions to me in advance of this keynote, and I'm going to do my best to weave them into my reflections here. As you all know, this year's theme is a more perfect union. And I'm not sure there could be a more perfect theme to explore right now. No matter where we live in the country or what our politics are, I'd wager that everyone is feeling what I would call the rawness of a struggling nation. The United States is struggling against the external assault of a deadly virus, but it's also struggling with deep internal tensions over the nation it wants to be. In the past year alone, we've lived through not just a pandemic, but also a bitterly contested presidential election that strained our voting laws, an attack on the US Capitol that threatened our representatives, ongoing protests over racial and gender equality, congressional hearings like the recent ones about Facebook that probed the limits of privacy and free speech in a digital age. We've also seen a nation wrestling not just with its present, but with its past, wrestling with what to celebrate versus what to chastise. We've seen Confederate monuments pulled down in Virginia. We've seen a Native American statue removed where you are in St. Louis. On the flip side, we've also seen lawmakers in Texas launch a textbook investigating committee to make sure students are taught American history in a sufficiently patriotic way. And with each action has come a corresponding backlash. Everywhere we look, we are acutely and sometimes very painfully reminded that we definitely have not yet reached the goal the framers set in the Constitution almost 250 years ago in the preamble. And that's the goal of forming a more perfect union. But what would it mean to form a more perfect union? And how do we do it? Are we closer today than ever before, or further away than we ever have been? Those are the questions that have really animated my work as a journalist at the Washington Post, and particularly my work on two podcast series I created, the first called Presidential, and then another series called Constitutional. In Presidential, I interviewed biographers about each of the 45 presidents, starting with George Washington and working my way up. And the idea was to examine the presidency and how it's shaped our democracy over time. For Constitutional, I undertook another massive project of interviewing historians and digging into archival material, but I expanded it beyond just presidents. I wanted a sense of the broader base of people who drove the evolution of the Constitution, or to put it another way, the people who shaped and then reshaped the values of this nation. I started my reporting for that podcast by diving into the writing of the Constitution itself in 1787. That year, a group of 55 white men met in Philadelphia to draft the framework for an entirely new nation. In a lot of our political debates today, these men are portrayed in absolutist terms, either as hypocrites or as heroes. So I went searching for answers, and the reality, of course, is somewhere in between. They did not chisel a perfect nation in 1787, but they did leave us the tools to further perfect it ourselves. Initially, the Constitution didn't extend representation and voting rights to the majority of people, not to women, not to Native Americans, not to enslaved people, not even to poor white men who didn't own property, which was a lot of men in this country. It also didn't guarantee the right to bear arms or even the freedom of speech. But they did create a process for changing the document. In Article 5, the framers explicitly made it possible to amend the Constitution, to alter everything that they had just spent months and months debating and finally committing to those pieces of parchment. And that, as Jeffrey Rosen, who's the head of the National Constitution Center, put it to me, that was perhaps the most courageous and revolutionary thing that they did. This was a time when kings across Europe were claiming divine right. And yet here were the framers of the US Constitution saying something radically opposite. In a way, it was radically humble. They were admitting right there on the page that they didn't have all the answers. They did know what values they thought were most important. They wrote in the preamble that they wanted to ensure the United States was a country with justice at its core, a country that was a peaceable place to live, that could mount a common defense, that cared for the general well-being of all of its citizens, a country that prized liberty. But they recognized that in order to form this more perfect union they envisioned, future generations would need to be able to update the Constitution, both in text and in interpretation. They realized that change was absolutely necessary to keep those core values alive. And so that's where the real story starts, with everything that came after 1787. Almost instantly after the Constitution was written, the story of American democracy became the story of making real that document's progress, or that document's promise. It became the story of extending liberty and representation to more and more people, 27 amendments were added, including, as we know, the right for men of color to vote, the right for women to vote, the right for citizens to vote once they reach 18, the abolishment of poll taxes, the establishment of presidential term limits, the peaceful transition of power. And behind each of these advances were both the powerful, but also, very importantly, the powerless in this country. It took suffragists like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and abolitionists like Frederick Douglass to push for new amendments that would extend the right to vote. It took a Supreme Court justice like Louis Brandeis to make the idea of privacy, which is actually a word that doesn't appear anywhere in the Constitution, but to make that idea of privacy really central to our definition today of what personal freedom means. It also took someone like Wong Kim Ark, a name most of us don't know, but he was a young boy born in the late 1800s in San Francisco to Chinese parents. And his case, which eventually went all the way to the Supreme Court, helped us cement what's required to be a US citizen. It took prisoners like those in Mississippi's Parchman Farm in the 1960s to make us rethink what constitutes cruel and unusual punishment. So what I'm saying is that to study the Constitution isn't just to study faded pieces of parchment paper that have been preserved in the National Archives in Washington, D.C. It's to study these figures. It's to study the participation of a whole nation in our constitutional story, and to realize that our path toward a more perfect union has not been a straight line. We have had presidents who wanted to expand voting rights, but we've also had presidents who wanted to sway elections. We've had amendments that gave more people the right to vote, but often that's been followed by new barriers created to impede the right to vote. In fact, if you look just at amendments, in some ways it would look like our progress has slowed down over time. Only one of the 27 amendments in the Constitution was added in the past 50 years. Political polarization across the states and certainly in the halls of Congress has made the process of ratifying amendments or even making any new laws harder and harder. But the framers gave us a host of other tools to also keep democracy moving forward. They gave us the courts, where we can update our interpretation of laws. They gave us what they called the blessings of liberty in the Bill of Rights, things like freedom of assembly, so we can protest and make our voices heard. They also gave us freedom of the press, which is a tool not just for uncovering the truth or holding those in office to account, but increasingly we see the press doing the type of work I do, which is a type of reporting on the past. You see it with the New York Times 1619 Project about slavery, or Slate's Slow Burn podcast about Richard Nixon. These are history projects, but the thing is, as William Faulkner famously said, the past is never dead. It's not even past. Making a history podcast or looking in any way at our history is really just a way of trying to understand our present, trying to understand the country we live in today, and also to pose the question, what path is our country on for the future? And I think the men who originally wrote the Constitution wanted all of us to engage in finding an answer to that question. And the key word, I think, is engage. They wanted us to keep the work going of trying to form a more perfect union. And perhaps also showing some humility in our own lives and our own politics right now, admitting that, like them, we don't have all the answers. and admitting that others, whether they're across the political aisle or they're in future generations, that they might have ideas that improve upon our own, that that's not only okay, but that that's crucial to this experiment. The work of forming a perfect union certainly isn't done, and likely it will never be done. But it is on all of us, whether we are judges, presidents, senators, journalists, citizens, to do that work. And I would say, if there is anything I have learned from my own work, it's that American democracy is not a static idea. By the framers' own design, it is an ongoing effort to expand the promise of the Constitution to more and more people, to take the goal of a more perfect union and to take the tools of democracy that the framers left us and to continue that work ourselves. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak tonight. I hope you enjoy the rest of this wonderful gala, and I wish you all a very happy Thanksgiving. If I were there in person, there would have been a Q&A portion after the talk. So in lieu of that, I'm going to answer just a few of the questions that some of you submitted beforehand, but that I didn't have a chance to touch on already. So here are a few of them. All right, question 1. Throughout your research, what are any future amendments you think might be likely to pass? All right, so I think probably the Equal Rights Amendment stands the best shot anytime soon. This is an amendment that was first floated as an idea 100 years ago, just shortly after women gained the right to vote. And the idea was that the Constitution should go one step further, and it should add another amendment guaranteeing all rights and protections to women as well as men. Now, the story of the Equal Rights Amendment has a ton of fascinating twists and turns, but by some calculations, it actually has all of the state ratifications that it would need to be added to the Constitution. And it's now basically in Congress's hands to decide whether to go ahead and officially put it in there. So while that's a very complicated and difficult question that's not necessarily going to be addressed right away by Congress, I do think it stands some chance of finally happening in the near future. All right, question 2. Is there a failed amendment that you wish would have passed? As someone who lived in DC for a decade and who still works in the nation's capital, I guess I would say the Washington, DC Voting Rights Amendment is a failed amendment that's of interest to me. It was originally proposed back in 1978, but there was a deadline put on its ratification and it did not meet that deadline. The deadline expired, so it was never ratified. But better representation for people who live in the district is, something that would personally be nice to see for a number of my colleagues and neighbors. All right, question 3. If you were making this podcast in 2021 or 2022, what additional episodes would you want to make? That's such an interesting question. And there were actually a couple of other questions that some of you submitted to me that I won't be able to get to addressing here exactly, but I do think they actually have the seeds for some great future constitutional episodes. So one would be an episode that tackles, questions about our digital lives and how the sort of rights given to us under the Constitution are going to extend or change as we live in more and more of a virtual space. Then another episode I think would be really interesting to do would be an entire episode on gridlock in Congress, looking into the origins of that gridlock and if there are any possible constitutional solutions that would help us break some of that impasse. Okay, the last question I'll answer here for the night. What's your next podcast or project? So this is a tricky question actually for me. I don't know because I recently had a baby and I've been on maternity leave. So that is precisely the question I'm going to tackle as soon as I return to work in a week. If you have ideas for a podcast about American history or something you want to better understand in the world around you that gives context to the headlines you see every day, please reach out to me and suggest a subject for the next podcast. Thank you so much and have a wonderful evening.